It started when I moved into a quaint little neighborhood on the outskirts of Austin. The houses were close enough for small-town charm, but far enough apart to give you privacy, or so I thought. Mine was a modest two-bedroom with a porch swing and a view of the woods. It felt like the perfect retreat after years of city life. I didn't expect that the real terror would come from next door. The house to my left had been vacant when I moved in. It was a slightly larger Victorian-style home with chipped paint and an air of neglect. A week after I settled in, I noticed a moving truck outside. A man and woman, both in their 40s, worked tirelessly to unload boxes. I introduced myself, but they seemed off. The man, tall and gaunt, barely looked at me while mumbling his name, Frank. The woman, pale with sunken eyes, smiled faintly and said her name was Linda. "Nice to meet you," I said, trying to make eye contact with either of them. "If you need help settling in, let me know." Frank didn't reply. Linda's smile didn't change, but her eyes darted toward the house. "We like to keep to ourselves," she murmured before they turned and walked inside. From that moment, things got strange. The first night, I heard a rhythmic knocking sound coming from their house. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent. Tap, 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 pause. Tap, tap, tap. I tried to ignore it, but it continued into the early hours. The next morning, I noticed strange markings on the tree that stood between our properties. Deep gouges like claw marks, almost too deliberate to be natural. The knocking became a nightly occurrence. Each time it started, my dog Max would growl low and refuse to go near the windows. I tried to brush it off as renovation work or some quirky hobby. But one night, curiosity got the better of me. I stepped out onto my porch, flashlight in hand, and shined it toward their house. The curtains twitched. A shadow moved in the window. "Hello?" I called out, feeling ridiculous. The tapping stopped abruptly, leaving the air heavy and silent. The next morning, Linda appeared on my porch. She held a plate of cookies, her hands trembling. "We've been meaning to welcome you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I accepted the plate, noting her bloodshot eyes and the faint bruises on her wrist. "Thanks. Are you all right?" Her head jerked toward their house, and her smile faltered. "Frank doesn't like outsiders. He's particular." Before I could ask anything more, she turned and hurried back. That night, the knocking was louder. This time, it wasn't just rhythmic. It was frantic, erratic, as if someone were trying to get out. I sat frozen in my bed, staring at the wall that faced their house. Then came the sound of scraping metal, followed by a muffled scream. I called the police. When they arrived, Frank greeted them with a calm demeanor, claiming he hadn't heard anything unusual. Linda stood behind him, her eyes downcast. The officers assured me everything was fine, but the moment they left, Frank turned his gaze toward my window. Even from that distance, I felt the weight of his stare. The next few days were quiet, but I noticed other neighbors avoiding me. When I waved at a woman walking her dog, she quickened her pace without acknowledging me. At the grocery store, the cashier hesitated before scanning my items. One evening, as I was locking up, I saw Linda standing in my yard. Her face was pale, her lips trembling. "You have to leave," she whispered. "What's going on?" I asked, stepping closer. "He knows you've been watching. He doesn't like it when people interfere." Before I could press her for details, Frank appeared at the edge of my property. His silhouette was backlit by the porch light, but I could feel his rage. Linda turned and ran to him, and he grabbed her arm, dragging her back inside. That night, I heard the screaming again. This time, it was louder, more desperate. I called the police a second time, but when they arrived, Frank told them I was harassing his family. They seemed to believe him. The next morning, Max wouldn't stop barking at the fence that separated our yards. When I went to investigate, I found a small, bloodied handprint on one of the wooden planks. I didn't sleep that night. The knocking returned, accompanied by whispers. They were faint, almost inaudible, but they carried a distinct plea. "Help me." Desperate, I decided to confront them. I knocked on their door, and when Frank answered, his expression was cold, unwelcoming. "I need to talk to Linda," I demanded. "She's not feeling well," he replied, stepping into the doorway to block my view inside. "I've heard things. Screams. I'm not imagining it." His smile was chilling. "You should mind your own business." I retreated, but that night I kept watch. Around 3 a.m., I saw Frank dragging something heavy out of the house, a large, lumpy sack. He carried it toward the woods, his movements deliberate. My hands shook as I dialed 911. When the police arrived, they searched the woods but found nothing. Frank was furious, glaring at me as the officers left. The next day, Linda was gone. Frank claimed she had gone to visit family, but her car was still in the driveway. Then came the final night. The knocking was relentless, so loud it felt like it was inside my own walls. Max barked furiously, his hackles raised. I grabbed a flashlight and ventured outside. As I approached their house, the front door creaked open. The living room was empty, but the air was thick with the smell of decay. I followed the noise to the basement, my heart pounding. The door at the bottom was slightly ajar. Pushing it open, I found a makeshift room with walls covered in scratch marks. Chains hung from the ceiling, and in the corner was a single chair with ropes dangling from its arms. Then I saw her, Linda, or what was left of her. Her lifeless body slumped in the corner, her mouth frozen in a silent scream. I stumbled back, my flashlight dropping to the ground. That's when I heard it, the soft click of the basement door locking behind me. Frank's voice came from the shadows. "You should have stayed out of it." The last thing I remember is the cold steel of a blade against my throat. When I woke up, I was in my own bed. The house next door was empty, the windows boarded up. The police told me the house had been abandoned for years, that no one named Frank or Linda had ever lived there. But every night, I still hear the knocking.
Story number 2.
When I moved into my new apartment, I was eager to escape the chaos of my old life. It was a small, cozy unit in a historic building on the outskirts of Boston. The neighbors seemed friendly enough, but one apartment at the end of the hall always caught my attention. Apartment 13B. The door was scratched and weathered, with peeling paint that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The brass numbers hung slightly askew. It was the only unit in the building that didn't have a welcome mat or any sign of life. I asked the landlord about it when I signed my lease. "What's the deal with 13B?" I joked. His expression darkened, and he shifted uncomfortably. "No one's lived there for years," he said curtly. "Just stay out of it. It's not available for rent." That should have been enough to make me leave it alone, but of course it wasn't. At first, it was just odd noises. Late at night, when the building was quiet, I'd hear faint scratching sounds coming from the direction of 13B. Sometimes it sounded like whispering, but it was so low I couldn't make out any words. I convinced myself it was nothing. Pipes, maybe, or the wind. Then one evening, as I was coming home from work, I saw the door to 13B slightly ajar. I stopped in my tracks. No one had ever gone in or out of that apartment, not in the months I'd lived there. Curiosity got the better of me. I stepped closer, peering inside. The air that drifted out was cold and stale, carrying the faint scent of mildew. The apartment was dark, but I could make out a single chair sitting in the middle of the room. It was turned away from the door, as if someone had been sitting there, watching the wall. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. Nothing. I should have walked away, but something compelled me to push the door open wider. The creak echoed down the empty hallway. I reached for the light switch, but it didn't work. My phone's flashlight would have to do. The walls inside were covered in faded, yellowed wallpaper, peeling at the edges. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I stepped inside. The chair was ancient, its wood splintered and gray with age. That's when I noticed the photographs. They were scattered across the floor, dozens of them, black and white with curled edges. I crouched down, picking one up. It showed a man standing in the very room I was in. His face was obscured, blurred, but his posture seemed wrong. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and his hands hung limply by his sides. I picked up another photo. This one was of a woman, standing in the same spot as the man. Her face was clearer, but her expression was one of sheer terror. A chill ran down my spine. I dropped the photos and backed toward the door. As I turned to leave, I froze. The door was closed. I didn't remember closing it. Suddenly, I felt it, a presence behind me. My heart pounded as I slowly turned around. The chair was no longer empty. A figure sat there, its body slouched, head hanging low. Its hair was stringy and black, obscuring its face. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out. The figure didn't move. But the air grew colder, and the scratching sound I'd heard before filled the room, louder now, coming from the walls. Panicked, I fumbled for the doorknob, yanking it open. As I ran out into the hallway, I heard it, a low, guttural laugh, echoing from the apartment. I slammed my door shut and locked it, my hands shaking. I barely slept that night, every creak of the building sending my heart racing. The next morning, I decided to confront the landlord. "There's something in 13B, I told him. His face paled, and he shook his head. "You shouldn't have gone in there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. What's going on? Is someone living there? He hesitated before finally saying, no one's lived there since the 80s. A couple moved in, but the husband disappeared one night. The wife claimed something in the apartment took him. No one believed her. She moved out, and strange things started happening. People who went in there didn't come out the same. That's ridiculous, I said, though my trembling hands betrayed me. Stay out of it, he warned. You don't want its attention. But it was too late. Over the next few days, I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision. Objects in my apartment weren't where I'd left them. My lights flickered constantly. And the whispering, it was louder now, not just at night, but all the time. It sounded like my name. One night, I woke to the sound of scratching at my door. Max, my neighbor's cat, hissed from the hallway, his fur bristling. Terrified, I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and opened the door. The hallway was empty, but on the floor, just outside my door, was one of the photographs from 13B. It was a picture of me, standing in my apartment, staring out my window. I hadn't taken it. The next morning, I packed my bags and left without looking back. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The window of 13B was no longer empty. A dark figure stood there, watching me leave.
Story number 3.
I moved into a quaint little house in a quiet Midwestern town after the divorce. It wasn't much, but it was mine. A place to start over. The house was old, built in the 1930s, with creaky floors and a rickety porch. It sat at the edge of the neighborhood, next to an overgrown lot that everyone seemed to avoid. The previous owner left in a hurry. When I asked the realtor why, she only shrugged. Job transfer, she said, but her eyes darted toward the house like she was glad to be rid of it. The first few nights were uneventful. I spent my time unpacking, getting to know the quirks of the old place. The pipes groaned and the windows rattled when the wind picked up, but that was to be expected. Then one night, I heard it. It was past midnight, and I was in bed, drifting off, when a soft tapping sound came from downstairs. At first, I thought it might be the wind or a branch against a window, but the sound was rhythmic, deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. I grabbed a flashlight and crept downstairs. The house was silent, except for the faint hum of the fridge. I checked the windows and doors, all locked. I told myself I was imagining things and went back to bed, but the tapping came back the next night. This time, it was louder. The following morning, I noticed something odd. On the back porch, just outside the sliding glass door, were muddy footprints. They were small, like those of a child, and led from the overgrown lot to my door. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a neighborhood kid playing a prank. I brushed it off and went about my day. That night, the tapping was accompanied by a faint whispering sound. It was so low I couldn't make out any words, but it sent chills down my spine. I called the police. They came out, checked the property, and found nothing. Probably just an animal, one of the officers said. Raccoons can make a racket, but raccoons don't leave child-sized footprints. The next morning, the footprints were back. This time, they were on the inside of the sliding door. I told myself it was impossible. I hadn't heard anyone come in, and the door was still locked. But there they were, perfectly formed in a trail that led from the door to the center of the living room before stopping abruptly. I scrubbed the floor and told myself I was imagining things. Stress, maybe. Lack of sleep. That night, I didn't go to bed. I sat in the living room, lights off, gripping a baseball bat. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. Around 2 a.m., the tapping started again. This time, it wasn't downstairs. It was upstairs. My heart pounded as I climbed the stairs, bat in hand. The tapping grew louder with each step. It was coming from the spare bedroom at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open slowly, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The room was empty except for a few unpacked boxes. But as I scanned the room, the beam of light caught something on the wall. Handprints. Dozens of them. Small, muddy handprints smeared across the wallpaper, as if someone or something had been trying to claw their way out. The air grew cold, and I felt a presence behind me. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. The tapping stopped. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I went to the local library to research the house. I found an article from 1978 about a boy named Caleb who had gone missing. The last place he was seen was in the overgrown lot next to my house. Search teams combed the area but found no trace of him. The article mentioned that Caleb's family had lived in my house. His bedroom, the spare room at the end of the hall. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence. But that night, the whispers came back, louder now, clearer. Help me. I froze, clutching the bat, my eyes darting around the room. The voice was high-pitched, childlike, but it didn't sound right. It had an echo to it, like it was coming from far away or from everywhere at once. Help me, it repeated. The air grew heavy, oppressive. The lights flickered, and I heard the sound of footsteps running up the stairs. I bolted out of the house and spent the night in my car. The next morning, I called a local paranormal investigator. I felt ridiculous even saying the words out loud, but I was desperate. When she arrived, she immediately looked uneasy. "This house has a dark history," she said. "I can feel it." She walked through the house, muttering prayers under her breath. In the spare bedroom, she stopped cold. "This is where it happened," she whispered. "Where what happened?" I asked, my throat dry. "The boy, Caleb. He didn't just go missing. He was taken by something that still lingers here." I wanted to leave, to burn the house to the ground and never look back. But the investigator insisted we try to communicate. She set up candles and a recorder in the spare room. As she began to speak, the temperature dropped and the whispers returned. "Why are you here?" she asked aloud. The recorder picked up a faint response. "Help me. Who are you?" "Caleb." I felt tears sting my eyes. The voice sounded so scared, so lost. The investigator continued. "What do you need?" There was a long pause, then a new voice came through the recorder. This one was deeper, angrier. "Leave." The candles flickered, and a loud crash came from the living room. We ran downstairs to find all the furniture overturned. The words "get out" were scratched into the wall. The investigator turned to me, her face pale. "You need to leave this house. Whatever is here, it's not just Caleb." I didn't argue. I packed my belongings and left that same night. The house still stands, empty now, the windows boarded up. Sometimes when I drive by, I swear I can see a figure standing in the spare room window, watching.
Story number 4.
I had always been a fan of the countryside. Wide open spaces, fresh air, and the kind of silence that makes city life feel like a distant memory. So, when I stumbled upon an old farmhouse for sale at an unbelievably low price, I didn't think twice. It was a little isolated, surrounded by dense woods on all sides, but I figured that was part of the charm. The previous owner, an elderly man named Mr. Harlan, had lived there alone for decades. According to the realtor, he had passed away in his sleep. Peaceful and natural, she said, though her tight smile suggested there was more to the story. I moved in during the fall, just as the leaves were turning fiery shades of orange and red. The house was beautiful in a weathered sort of way, with creaky floorboards and windows that rattled in the wind. It felt alive, like it had a soul. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time unpacking and wandering the property. The woods were dense, the trees gnarled and twisted, their branches forming eerie shapes in the twilight. There was a small, overgrown path leading deeper into the forest, but something about it felt off. I stayed away. One night, as I was settling in with a cup of tea, I heard it for the first time, a faint knocking sound coming from the back door. At first, I thought it was the wind or an animal, but when I opened the door, there was nothing there, just the darkness of the woods and the faint rustling of leaves. The knocking came again the next night. This time it was louder and more insistent. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. No response. I turned on the porch light, but it flickered and died immediately. When I stepped outside, flashlight in hand, the beam caught something in the distance. A figure just at the edge of the woods. It was too far to make out any details, but it was tall and unmoving. My stomach knotted with fear. I called out again, but the figure disappeared into the shadows. The next morning, I found strange markings on the back door. They were scratches, long and deep, as if something or someone had tried to claw its way inside. I called the local sheriff, but he shrugged it off. "Probably a raccoon," he said. "They can be vicious. But raccoons don't stand 6 feet tall." The following nights were worse. The knocking turned into pounding ska, and the whispers started. They were faint at first, just on the edge of hearing. But as the days passed, they grew louder. "Let us in." The voices were distorted, layered, like multiple people speaking at once. Sometimes they sounded like a child. Other times they were deep and guttural. I stopped sleeping. I stopped eating. I was constantly on edge, jumping at every sound. One night, the whispers grew so loud they seemed to fill the entire house. I barricaded myself in my bedroom, clutching a knife. The air grew icy cold and the pounding on the walls began. "Let us in," the voices demanded. Then, silence. I stayed awake until dawn, too terrified to move. When the sun rose, I ventured downstairs. The house was eerily still. But on the kitchen table, there was something that hadn't been there before. A photograph. It was old, black and white, and slightly faded. It showed the farmhouse, but the surrounding woods were different. Less overgrown, more open. Standing in front of the house was a group of people. Their faces were blurred, but their postures were unnatural. Stiff. I flipped the photo over. Scrawled on the back in shaky handwriting were the words, "We are here." I left the house immediately and drove into town. At the library, I searched for anything I could find about the property. The farmhouse had a dark history. In the 1920s, it had belonged to a family named the Marshalls. They had mysteriously vanished one night, leaving behind a blood-stained kitchen and no explanation. Over the decades, other owners had reported strange occurrences, voices, knocking, and figures in the woods. Most left within months. I felt sick. The stories were all too similar to what I was experiencing. That night, I decided to stay at a motel. As I packed my bags, I heard footsteps upstairs. Heavy, deliberate. I froze. I was alone. The footsteps grew louder, descending the stairs. I grabbed my car keys and bolted for the door. As I started the engine, I glanced back at the house. In the upstairs window, I saw them. Shadowy figures, dozens of them, staring down at me. Their faces were blurred, just like in the photograph. I drove away, my hands shaking. The farmhouse is still there, abandoned now. Locals say it's cursed, that the spirits of the Marshalls and whoever or whatever else resides there don't take kindly to intruders. Sometimes, I wake in the middle of the night and hear the faint sound of knocking.
Story number 5.
When I first moved into my apartment, it seemed like the perfect place to start fresh. It was a small, affordable unit in a quiet neighborhood, and the building manager, an elderly woman named Mrs. Connors, was kind enough to help me move in. The place wasn't fancy, but it was clean, and I couldn't ask for more. Except for one thing, the door across the hall. Apartment 6C. Its door was a dark mahogany color, heavily scuffed and chipped at the edges. There was no welcome mat, no wreath, no sign of life. Mrs. Connors had mentioned it briefly as we walked by during the tour. "Oh, don't worry about 6C, she said. "No one lives there, hasn't been occupied for years." Her tone had been dismissive, like she didn't want to talk about it. At first, I didn't think much of it. I settled into my routine, unpacking during the day and relaxing in the evenings. The building was quiet, almost too quiet. Most of my neighbors kept to themselves, and the hallway always felt eerily still. One night, about a week after I moved in, I heard it. 3 soft knocks on my door. It was just after midnight, and I was in bed, scrolling on my phone. I froze, straining to listen. My heart raced as I sat up. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. I waited a moment before getting up and looking through the peephole. The hallway was empty. I convinced myself it was nothing, probably one of the neighbors knocking on the wrong door. But the next night, it happened again. 3 knocks, soft and deliberate. This time I opened the door immediately. The hallway was as empty as before. But then, I noticed something strange. The door to 6C was slightly ajar. A chill ran down my spine. I stood there, staring at the dark gap, unsure of what to do. I thought about knocking or calling out, but something stopped me. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like the building itself was holding its breath. I shut my door and locked it, determined to ignore whatever was happening. Over the next few nights, the knocks became more frequent. They would come at random times, early in the evening, in the dead of night, even once at dawn. Always 3 knocks. Always no one there. One morning, I decided to ask Mrs. Connors about 6C. "Oh, it's nothing to worry about," she said, avoiding my eyes. "Just an old unit. Been empty for years. No one goes in or out." "But the door," I started, but she cut me off. "Don't trouble yourself with it, dear. Some things are better left alone." Her words unsettled me, but I didn't press her. That evening, as I returned home from work, I noticed something strange. A faint, wet footprint on the carpet just outside 6C. It was small, like that of a child, and it led from the door to mine. I stood there, staring at the print, my heart pounding. I looked around, but the hallway was empty. That night, the knocks came louder. Bang! 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 I jumped out of bed, adrenaline surging. This wasn't soft or polite. This was aggressive. I grabbed a kitchen knife and crept to the door, pressing my ear against it. On the other side, I heard faint breathing. Slow, shallow. I swung the door open, knife raised. No one was there. But the door to 6C was wide open now, revealing nothing but darkness inside. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I stepped into the hallway, my knife trembling in my hand, and approached 6C. The air grew colder with every step. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing into the void. No response. I shone my phone's flashlight into the apartment. It was completely empty. No furniture, no signs of anyone living there. The walls were cracked and stained, the floor coated in a thick layer of dust. But then I saw them. Handprints. Dozens of small, child-sized handprints smeared across the walls, some high up near the ceiling. They were dark, almost black, and looked fresh. I backed out of the apartment, heart racing, and slammed the door shut. The next day, I went back to Mrs. Connors, demanding answers. She looked at me with tired, haunted eyes. "I told you to leave it alone," she said. "That apartment, it's not empty. Not really." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. She hesitated before continuing. "Years ago, a family lived there, a mother and her young son. The boy was troubled. He heard voices, saw things. The mother kept him locked inside most of the time. One day, they both disappeared. No one knows what happened to them. Some say the boy, he never left." I felt a chill run down my spine. "I've tried to keep people away from it," she said, "but sometimes it reaches out." That night, the knocking didn't come. Instead, I woke to the sound of a child's laughter. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, echoing through my apartment. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and saw it, a figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was a boy, no older than 6, his pale face barely visible in the dim light. His eyes were wide and black, his smile unnaturally stretched. "Play with me," he whispered. I screamed and turned on the bedside lamp. He was gone. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I packed my things and left. I didn't tell Mrs. Connors. I couldn't face her. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The boy was standing in the window of 6C, watching me leave.
Story number 6.
I had always prided myself on being logical, grounded in reality. Ghost stories, urban legends, and tales of the supernatural. Entertaining, sure, but I never believed them. That changed when I moved into the old Victorian house on Mulberry Street. I'd rented it sight unseen, lured by the promise of a spacious home at an absurdly low price. The realtor had been vague when I asked about its history. "It's been vacant for a while," she said, her tone dismissive. "You're getting a great deal." The house was charming at first glance. Tall windows, intricate woodwork, and a wraparound porch that looked like something out of a storybook. Inside, it was dusty and smelled faintly of mildew, but nothing a good cleaning couldn't fix. My first night there, I noticed something odd. The house had a peculiar silence to it, the kind that presses against your ears. No creaks, no groans, no distant hum of appliances, just silence. As I unpacked, I discovered an old photo tucked into the frame of the living room mirror. It showed a family, a man, a woman, and 2 young children. They were standing in front of the house, smiling stiffly. Something about their eyes made me uneasy, but I chalked it up to the poor quality of the photograph. I left the photo on the mantel and went to bed. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, moving from one end of the house to the other. I froze, straining to listen. The house was locked. I'd checked twice before going to bed. Grabbing a heavy flashlight, I crept downstairs. No one was there, but the photo on the mantel was gone. The next morning, I found it lying face down on the floor. Assuming it had fallen, I picked it up and placed it back on the mantel, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. Doors I'd left closed would be open when I returned. Lights flickered even after I replaced the bulbs. My cat, Cleo, hissed at empty corners, her fur bristling. Then came the whispers. At first, they were faint, just at the edge of hearing, like a radio playing in another room. I couldn't make out the words, but they sounded urgent, insistent. One night, while reading in the living room, the whispers grew louder. They seemed to come from the walls themselves, surrounding me. "Get out!" a voice hissed. I jumped, my heart racing. "Who's there?" I called out, though I already knew I wouldn't get an answer. Instead, the whispers stopped abruptly, leaving the house in that suffocating silence. I told myself it was just stress, an overactive imagination fueled by the eeriness of the old house. But that explanation crumbled the night I saw her. It was late, and I was brushing my teeth when I caught movement in the mirror. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but when I looked closer, I saw her. A woman standing behind me, her face pale and drawn, her eyes dark and sunken. She was only there for a second, but it was enough to send me stumbling backward, knocking over the toothbrush holder. When I turned around, she was gone. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I decided to dig into the house's history. At the library, I found an article about the family in the photo. Their names were the Hargroves, and they'd lived in the house during the early 1900s. The article detailed a tragedy. One night, Mrs. Hargrove had drowned her 2 children in the bathtub before taking her own life. Mr. Hargrove, who'd been away on business, returned to find their bodies. He moved out immediately, and the house had been sold several times since, each owner leaving after experiencing strange occurrences. I felt sick reading the article, but it explained so much. That night, the activity escalated. As I lay in bed, the air grew icy cold. The sound of water dripping echoed through the house, though all the faucets were off. Then came the laughter. It was faint at first, like children playing, but it grew louder, shriller, until it filled the room. I bolted upright, and that's when I saw them. 2 small figures stood at the foot of my bed. A boy and a girl, their faces pale and expressionless. Their clothes were soaked, water dripping from their hair. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The boy raised his hand and pointed at me. "She's coming," he whispered. The bedroom door slammed shut, and the laughter turned into sobbing. I scrambled out of bed, grabbed my car keys, and ran. As I fled down the stairs, I saw her, Mrs. Hargrove, standing in the living room. Her eyes locked onto mine, and she opened her mouth in a silent scream. I didn't stop running until I was in my car, speeding away from the house. I never went back. The house still sits there, empty and decaying. Sometimes when I drive by, I swear I can see a woman's face in the window, watching.
Story number 7.
When I inherited my grandmother's house, I wasn't particularly excited. Sure, it was a free home, but it was also a ramshackle old farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. The paint was peeling, the roof sagged in places, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. Still, I needed a change, so I packed up my life and moved in. The first couple of weeks were uneventful. I spent my days fixing what I could and making the house livable. The nights, though, were a different story. The countryside was unnervingly quiet, except for the occasional creak of the old wooden house settling. But then the scratching started. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible. I dismissed it as mice in the walls and made a mental note to buy traps. But each night the scratching grew louder, more deliberate, like fingernails clawing at wood. One night I decided to investigate. With a flashlight in hand, I scoured the house, checking every corner and crevice. The sound seemed to be coming from beneath the floorboards in the living room. The cellar. I'd only been down there once before. It was a damp, dark space with a dirt floor and the distinct smell of decay. The kind of place that made your skin crawl even in broad daylight. I pried open the trapdoor and descended the creaking wooden stairs, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The scratching stopped the moment I stepped into the cellar. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the confined space. Nothing. I scanned the area, the flashlight illuminating dusty shelves and cobweb-covered beams. The sound didn't return, so I chalked it up to my imagination and went back upstairs. That night I dreamed of her for the first time. She was standing at the edge of the bed, her face obscured by long, matted hair. Her arms hung limply at her sides, but her fingers twitched, long nails tapping against each other. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. She leaned in close, her breath cold against my ear. "Why are you here?" I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. The following day, I found scratches on the trapdoor leading to the cellar. They were deep, jagged grooves, as though something had tried desperately to claw its way out. I convinced myself it was an animal. It had to be. But then things escalated. The next night, I woke to the sound of whispers. Faint, unintelligible, but undeniably there. They seemed to be coming from inside the walls. I pressed my ear to the drywall, heart pounding. "Leave," a voice hissed. I stumbled back, my pulse racing. In the days that followed, objects began to move on their own. Doors slammed shut, lights flickered, and once I came home to find every cabinet in the kitchen wide open. Then came the banging. It started one night around 3 a.m., loud and relentless. It sounded like fists pounding on the trapdoor. I stayed in bed, paralyzed with fear, clutching the covers as the banging grew louder. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I called a local contractor to seal off the cellar permanently. When he arrived, I explained the situation as vaguely as possible. He gave me a skeptical look, but agreed to take a look. After about 10 minutes, he came back upstairs, his face pale. "You didn't tell me about the bones," he said. My stomach dropped. "What bones?" "In the corner of the cellar," he said. "It looks like animal bones, maybe a raccoon or something, but they're arranged weirdly." I followed him down, my heart in my throat. Sure enough, in the far corner of the cellar, there was a pile of bones. They were small, brittle, and yellowed with age. But the way they were arranged was disturbing. They formed a crude circle with what looked like a human tooth placed at the center. "I'm not touching that," the contractor said, backing away. "You should call someone." After he left, I stood there staring at the circle of bones. My grandmother had never mentioned anything about the cellar. She was a practical woman, not the type to believe in ghosts or curses. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house set my nerves on edge. Around 2 a.m., the whispers started again, louder this time. I got up and grabbed my flashlight, determined to put an end to this. I opened the trapdoor and shone the beam down into the cellar. She was there, standing in the center of the bone circle, her back to me. Her hair hung in damp, stringy clumps, and her head twitched unnaturally, like she was listening to something I couldn't hear. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out. She didn't respond. I took a step back, my hand trembling as I gripped the flashlight. That's when she turned. Her face was gaunt, her skin stretched tight over her skull. Empty black sockets stared back at me where her eyes should have been. "Why are you here?" she whispered, her voice raspy and hollow. I slammed the trapdoor shut and bolted it. The next day, I packed up and left. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. Who would believe me? The house still stands, empty and rotting. Sometimes I think about going back to destroy it, to burn it to the ground. But then I remember her face, and I know she's still there, waiting in the darkness.
Story number 8.
I was never one to believe in ghost stories. Growing up, I would laugh at my friends when they whispered about haunted houses or cursed woods. But that all changed after I moved into the apartment on Sycamore Street. It was supposed to be temporary. I had just landed a new job in the city, and the apartment was cheap, close to work, and, on the surface, perfect for starting over. The building was old, a pre-war brick structure with creaky stairs and peeling paint, but I didn't mind. When I signed the lease, the landlord, Mr. Greaves, seemed hesitant. "You sure you want this place?" he asked, rubbing his temples. "It's affordable, and it's in my budget," I replied, laughing. He sighed. "Just don't go messing with apartment 3B. That one's been vacant for years." I nodded, not giving his warning a second thought. My apartment 2C was directly below 3B. The first week was uneventful. I worked long hours and spent my evenings unpacking or watching TV. The building was quiet. I rarely saw any of the other tenants. That changed one rainy night when I was woken up by a loud crash directly above me. I bolted upright in bed, heart racing. It sounded like furniture being dragged across the floor, followed by heavy footsteps. I checked the clock. 2:47 a.m. Remembering Mr. Greaves' warning, I brushed it off. Maybe he was having the place renovated, or maybe squatters had broken in. Either way, I didn't want to get involved. But the noise continued the next night, and the next. Footsteps, dragging sounds, and faint murmurs that sounded like someone talking. Finally, I called Mr. Greaves. "There's been noise coming from 3B at night," I told him. "Are you renovating it?" His voice was quiet, almost nervous. "Nobody's in 3B. Hasn't been anyone there for years. But I can hear. I'll check it out," he said, cutting me off. That evening, he came by to investigate. I followed him up the stairs as he unlocked the door to 3B. The apartment was empty. The air inside was stale, the walls covered in peeling wallpaper. A thick layer of dust coated the floors, and there were no signs that anyone had been there. Mr. Greaves turned to me. "See? Nothing here." I apologized for bothering him and went back to my apartment, embarrassed. But the noises didn't stop. One night, the sound of footsteps woke me again. This time they were in my apartment. I froze in bed, clutching the blankets. The steps were heavy, deliberate, moving slowly from the living room toward my bedroom. I forced myself to sit up, my pulse pounding in my ears. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. The footsteps stopped. Summoning every ounce of courage, I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. I stepped into the hallway, the beam trembling in my hands. No one was there. But as I turned toward the living room, I saw it. A shadow, darker than the night, slipping through the wall and disappearing into the ceiling. The air grew icy cold and my breath fogged in front of me. That's when I heard it. A child's voice, faint and distant, whispering, "Come upstairs." I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I confronted Mr. Greaves. "Something is wrong with this building," I said. "I keep hearing noises and now I'm seeing things." He hesitated before responding. You're not the first tenant to say that? What do you mean? He sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. Years ago, a woman and her son lived in 3B. She was troubled. One night, she locked herself and the boy inside. By the time anyone noticed something was wrong, it was too late. She drowned him in the bathtub before taking her own life. A chill ran down my spine. The place has been strange ever since, he continued. People hear noises, see shadows. No one stays here long. I wanted to leave right then, but my lease was ironclad, and I couldn't afford to break it. That night, the sounds returned, louder and more insistent. The footsteps were joined by soft crying, like a child sobbing. I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing a flashlight, I made my way upstairs to 3B. The door was slightly ajar. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I pushed the door open. The apartment was different this time. The air was heavy, oppressive, and a damp smell filled my nostrils. Then I saw her. She was standing in the corner, facing the wall, her hair matted and wet. She wore a tattered nightgown and water dripped from her hands. "Why are you here?" she rasped, her voice echoing in the empty space. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. She turned slowly, and I saw her face, sunken eyes, gray skin, and a twisted smile that didn't reach her dead eyes. Behind her, the shadow of a small boy appeared, his form flickering like static. "He's waiting for you," she whispered, stepping closer. I bolted, running down the stairs and out of the building. I didn't stop until I was in my car, speeding away. I never went back to the apartment. I lost my security deposit, my belongings, everything. Sometimes late at night, I hear faint whispers. Come upstairs.
Story number 9.
It all started with the clock. I just moved into a small one-bedroom apartment in an old brick building downtown. The place had character. Arched doorways, creaky wooden floors, and antique fixtures. But the thing that caught my attention the most was the grandfather clock in the corner of the living room. It was beautiful, made of dark mahogany with intricate carvings. It didn't seem like something the previous tenant had left behind. It looked far older, out of place in such a modest apartment. When I asked the landlord about it, he shrugged. "Been here longer than me," he said. "Nobody's ever taken it out, and honestly, it's so heavy I've never tried." I wasn't particularly superstitious, so I decided to leave it alone. It was charming in its own way, even if its ticking was a little too loud at night. The first week was uneventful, but the second week brought the dreams. At first, they were vague, just flashes of movement or shadowy figures in the corners of my vision, but they grew more vivid with each passing night. I'd find myself standing in front of the clock, its pendulum swinging slower and slower until it stopped. In the dream, a figure would emerge from the shadows, a tall man dressed in old-fashioned clothes, his face obscured by darkness. He never spoke, but his presence filled me with dread. I'd always wake up at exactly 3:14 a.m., the sound of the clock's chime echoing in my ears. By the third week, the dreams began bleeding into my waking life. It started small. I'd catch glimpses of movement in the reflection of the clock's glass. Once, I thought I saw a handprint smudged on the clock's face, but when I wiped it with a cloth, it disappeared. Then the noises began. At night, I'd hear faint whispers, just barely audible over the ticking of the clock. I couldn't make out the words, but they were insistent, like someone trying desperately to get my attention. One night, I decided to stop the clock. If it wasn't ticking, maybe I'd sleep better. I opened the glass case, reached in, and gently stilled the pendulum. The moment it stopped, the apartment fell silent. Not just quiet, silent. No hum from the refrigerator, no distant traffic sounds, not even the creak of the old building settling. Then the whispering started again. This time it was louder, clearer. "Don't stop it," a voice hissed, low and menacing. My hand shot back from the clock, as though I'd been burned. The pendulum began swinging again, though I hadn't touched it. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch, staring at the clock, too terrified to move. The next day, I did some research on the building. It didn't take long to find the story. The clock had belonged to a man named Victor Harland, who lived in the building in the early 1900s. He was a reclusive watchmaker, known for his skill, but also for his peculiar habits. Neighbors often heard him talking to himself late at night, arguing with someone who wasn't there. One day, Victor vanished. No one saw him leave the building, and his apartment was left untouched. The only clue was his clock, which had stopped ticking at exactly 3:14 a.m. They say he died while working on the clock, and his soul became trapped within it. The clock was passed down through the building's owners, but strange occurrences followed it wherever it went. I didn't want to believe it, but everything I'd experienced pointed to one conclusion. The clock was cursed. That night, I resolved to get rid of it. I didn't care how heavy it was. I'd find a way to haul it out of the apartment. As I approached the clock, its pendulum slowed, as if sensing my intentions. The air in the room grew cold, and the whispers returned, louder than ever. "Don't touch it," the voice commanded. I ignored it, grabbing the clock by its sides and trying to tip it forward. The moment I touched it, the room went dark. Not just dark, pitch black, as if the light itself had been sucked away. I couldn't see my own hands in front of my face. Then I heard him. "Why are you here?" The voice was deep, resonant, and impossibly close. I turned, but there was no one there. A hand clamped down on my shoulder, ice cold and unyielding. I screamed, but no sound came out. The darkness pressed in around me, suffocating and oppressive. In the distance, I could hear the ticking of the clock, louder and faster than before. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the lights came back on. The clock was gone. I stood there, trembling, staring at the empty corner where it had stood. The air was heavy with the scent of burning wood, and faint scorch marks were etched into the floor. I packed my things and left the apartment that night, breaking my lease without a second thought. I don't know where the clock went, and I don't care. Sometimes, though, in the middle of the night, I wake up at 3:14 a.m. to the sound of faint ticking.
Story number 10.
It started when I moved into that small, rundown apartment on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, but it was all I could afford at the time. The neighborhood was quiet enough, and for the most part, the people seemed friendly, if not a little peculiar. Then there was Mr. Hensley. He lived directly across the hall. An older man with thick glasses and a permanently stooped posture, Mr. Hensley had an unsettling aura about him. His apartment door was always slightly ajar, just enough to make you feel like he was watching, listening. But the thing that stuck with me most was his habit of humming, this low, monotonous tune that echoed through the hallways late at night. At first, I tried to ignore it. Everyone has their quirks, right? But something about that humming seemed to seep into my bones, making it impossible to sleep. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, the sound drilling into my skull like a needle. One night, about 2 weeks after I'd moved in, the humming stopped abruptly around midnight. I should have felt relieved, but instead the silence was suffocating. It was like the air had been sucked out of the building. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping on my apartment wall. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The tapping was slow and deliberate, like someone was counting. 1, 2, 3, and then it stopped. I stared at the wall, half expecting it to burst open, but nothing happened. The next morning, I decided to confront Mr. Hensley. As I stepped out into the hallway, I noticed something strange. A long, deep scratch running along the edge of his door frame. It looked like it had been made by something sharp, too sharp to be human. When I knocked, the door creaked open on its own. "Mr. Hen's out," but there was no response. I stepped inside, and immediately I regretted it. The apartment was dark, the air heavy with a sickly, sweet odor. The walls were covered in strange symbols, carved deep into the plaster. In the center of the living room was a table, and on it sat dozens of small, crudely made dolls, each one staring back at me with black, bead-like eyes. As I backed away, something moved in the shadows. A low, guttural growl filled the room, and I ran. I didn't stop running until I was back in my own apartment, my hands trembling as I locked the door behind me. I decided then and there that I needed to get out. Whatever was going on with Mr. Hensley, I wanted no part of it. But leaving wasn't as easy as I thought it would be. That night, as I packed my bags, the power went out. The apartment plunged into darkness, and I was left with nothing but the faint glow of my phone screen. Then I heard it again, that humming. But this time, it wasn't coming from the hallway. It was inside my apartment. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, I turned, and there, standing in the corner of my living room, was Mr. Hensley. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking, and his mouth was moving in that same monotonous hum. Before I could react, he lunged at me. I stumbled back, crashing into the coffee table, but when I looked up, he was gone. The room was empty, the humming replaced by an eerie, oppressive silence. The next morning, I went to the building manager, desperate for answers. But when I mentioned Mr. Hensley, his face went pale. "That's not possible," he said, shaking his head. "Mr. Hensley's been dead for years. He died in that apartment, right across the hall." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Dead? How could he be dead? I'd seen him, spoken to him, but the manager insisted, showing me an old newspaper clipping. It was an obituary dated 5 years earlier. The photo was unmistakable. It was Mr. Hensley. Terrified, I decided to leave that night. I didn't care about the lease or my deposit. I just wanted to get as far away as possible. But as I packed my things, I found something that made my blood run cold. Sitting on my bed was one of those dolls, the same black, bead-like eyes staring back at me. Clutched in its tiny hand was a piece of paper with a single word scrawled across it: stay. I left everything behind that night. I didn't even bother to lock the door. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and for a split second I saw him, standing in the middle of the road, watching me. I never went back to that apartment, and I've never told anyone this story until now. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear that humming, faint and distant, like a warning or a promise.